What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over our quest system part 4. So in this episode of the quest system, we are going to be going over how to make quests a lot more easily and add them to a data table. And it will also allow us to keep our data for our quests separate from the game mode, so we don't have all these dependencies. We can just have a section where all of our quest data is. So visually, you can't really see anything different than our regular quest system. It still works, whereas if I defeat my opponents, such as the golem, then I get rid of that objective on my quest HUD, and if I pick up 2 pickups, I get rid of that objective, and then my quest is complete. So everything's still functioning the same. However, we are not going to be using our hard-coded values today. Before we get into today's episode, just want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon members and YouTube membership subscribers. Thank you guys for all the love and support. I really appreciate it. I'm so excited to keep working on these series, and I'm glad you guys are enjoying it as much as I am. Thank you so much for everything. With that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. So if you guys are interested in catching up in this series, I'll link the entire playlist to the third person and action RPG tutorial right here in the top right corner. Alternatively, if you just care about the quest system, I'll link you to the quest system part 1. I'll link you to this episode right here in the top right corner, which is where we initially set up the quest system in this series. So part 1 of the quest system. We're going to have changes in our code and in the blueprints today, so let's go to the code, and we're going to want to go to our base quest.h. So base quest is our class where we initially set up all the data for the quests. Everything that's in here is still good as of now. I am going to add a new structure. So before we do this, we're going to need to make sure that we can make a data table out of the structure. And to do that, we have to make our structure an instance of a specific type. So we need a data table. We need the data table type to make each element in our structure part of the row base class. And you'll see that right here, ftable row base. This variable type you won't be able to access unless you have this include above. The first thing we need to do in our code is add this include. Make sure it is above your .generated.h include. Unreal wants that include to remain at the bottom. If it doesn't, it will give you errors. So I put it the line above that line, not below it. And it just include engine/datatable.h. Doing this will get us access to the type that we need. So I'm going to scroll down below all the rest of my structures. I have F objective here. I'm scrolling down, and before I get into my class, the actual base quest class, I've made a new structure now, and I've called it fquest. You call it fquest data or whatever you really want. The reason we're making a structure here of quest is because you can't make a data table out of a class. You have to make it out of a structure. And so even though we have the base quest class that has a lot of data here, we need a structure with the data that we want to fill out within the data table. So let's make a uStruct that is blueprint type so we can access it in the blueprint. And I'm calling mine fquest, like I said. Normally when you make a struct, you might not have anything here if you're not having it inherit a specific object type. In this case, we need it to be of that ftable row base that I was mentioning earlier. So you just put a colon after the name of your structure, public, and then the class type. So in this case, we want our ftable row base structure. And that will allow us to actually use this fquest in our blueprint as a data table. Now, like any other structure, you're going to want to put your generated body here. So you can add that line. That is a macro that Unreal uses. You don't have to put a semicolon after this line. In fact, if you do, it can cause issues. And then I just have 4 variables in here, and I have the name of the quest, the description of the quest, the reward that you get for beating the quest, and the objectives of the quest. I made them all public variables so we can access them in the struct, but really what's going on here is I'm not making these new variables. These variables are already inside of the base quest class. I just copied them and pasted them in here. So essentially, we're making this structure, which is a smaller version of our base quest.h, and then we can pass that data along to the data table so that anyone can edit that data table to make new quests quick and easy. Then all we have to do is pull the proper row from the data table to grab the quest data, so either the quest we're on or maybe the next quest we're unlocking, and we can grab all the information about it from that data table. Now note that I don't have all my variables in here. Something like character assigned to quest, I don't have in this structure. The only thing you want to put in this structure are things that are static for the data table. Things that you can fill out before playing the game. So if nobody's playing the game, we still have all the information for all the quests in the game. We don't want to try and factor in what character owns the quest or anything like that. We just care about the actual details of the quest. Now with that, we can actually get rid of these variables if we'd like. We don't need two instances. We don't need the structure having these variables and the class having these variables. Another thing to note is if you scroll up to your F objective structure, we had this F string description, which is the description of the objective. How we actually get this value is by taking two things that we put in, such as if it's a slay quest, meaning we have to defeat a certain number of enemies, then we can go ahead and put the number required. So if we have to slay 2 and we've killed 1, we only have 1 left, so we'll put 1 right in there. And then we'll put the rest of the description in. So this setup objective had 2 descriptions that it took in, description 1, description 2. We ended up combining them together with the number required to make the overall description. Since the description is now going to be made through the data table and not a hard-coded value, we do want to have a slot to input both of those. Or in other words, we want to have description 1 and description 2 as inputs in the data table. So because of that, I've added a description start and description end to the F objective structure. These were not here before, but I'm adding them now. The description variable can actually stay because that is the combined value. And so we do need a variable that can hold that combined string. This just makes it easier for editing the data table so that we can print the exact text that we want to the player's screen. Now with this out of the way, we can go into the blueprint. So go to wherever you make your data tables. I've made other data tables in this series, but it's okay if you haven't. I have a data folder, and I have all my data tables and blueprint structures in here as well. So in here, I just go ahead and add new. So add, and go to miscellaneous, and I choose data table. When you do this, you'll pick your row structure, and you'll have all the structures that you can select to make a data table out of. Now this is important because at this point, this is where we need to pick our F quest structure. And here it is right here. It's just called quest. It actually removes the F for you because F is just a prefix for these structures. But this is the structure that I want. Now once you find it, you'll select it and then you'll hit OK. This will make a data table. I've already done one, so I canceled instead. But open it up. Once you open it up, the first thing we should do is add at least one row so that we can see everything we're working with. You can click add up at the top to add a new row. I already have 2. You can add more by clicking add. It's that simple. And we can set up a quest. I've already set up the initial one the same way we set up in the game mode. So it's the same quest that we had in the game mode BP, but I'm using the data table as opposed to the game mode hard-coded values. So after you hit add new, you can click on the row. I'd recommend expanding your columns if they're not already. For me, when I come into data tables, they're always like really on top of each other like this. And that's pretty ugly and makes it really hard to see. So I like to just give myself some room. Now, by default, the rows are numbered starting at 1. I prefer to have the row name numbered as the indices here. So I actually start the row name at 0. Next one would be 1. Next one would be 2. But that is up to you. You can call it like the actual name of the quest. You don't need to follow my exact logic here. It is up to you what you call them. But I am going to use the row name as an index so that when we go to change quests later, say in our menu, or when we unlock new quests, we can use the index of the quest to grab the data from the row. So you can right click on the row you're on and rename it, and then that is where I put in the name. So instead of being new row, put 0, this one is 1, and as an example here, I can name this new one we just made to 2. It's that simple. Now, when you're on your row, you can change all the variables that are within that structure. So it's very simple. I have getting started and getting started part 2. These are quests that I've already set up in the data table, but we can go over making a new one. So we can say learning the basics. That will be the name of the quest. I know we have getting started part 2, and learning the basics, but maybe this is a really intense game and apparently we need 3 tutorial quests. For the description, this is the description of the quest. You could actually leave it empty if you want, it's not required, or you could say learn the initial controls of the game. It could be like this, it could be whatever you want. It's just text to describe the quest. So, again, completely optional. Now we have reward. Now reward is something we set up in the other quest episodes where once we complete the quest, we actually earn this as a reward. So you can have default, which could be an item and experience, or some other combination of those. Experience, which would be used theoretically for just rewarding the character with experience, and item, which is theoretically used for just rewarding an item to the character. So I can use default, and I can award them with an axe, standard axe BP, and I can give them 50 or 25 experience. Now after that, we also have the objectives. The objectives are those little subtasks that I had while I was playing the game. So this is the quest name, this is the description of the quest, these are the individual objectives. So for the objectives, you can click on the little plus here to add elements to your array, and it will create one objective, and then you can fill out all the information. So the clear type is default, which is some combination or some miscellaneous one. But we also have slay, which is to kill a number of enemies, collect, which is to pick up a certain number of items, and then travel, which is to reach a destination, which we actually haven't done yet. So for example, I could say slay. For the enemy to slay, I can use any enemy. This is the parent enemy, so any enemy will count. We'll have no item to collect on this one. For the description, we don't really need to fill out anything here because we're going to use our description start and end, but you could fill out the description if you want. This could be your placeholder text, or it could be the text that you use if you don't need the start and end logic. For example, description. It could be defeat an enemy. At this point, I don't actually have like a numerical value that's being tracked to determine how many are left, so I don't need to do any splitting of the description. I can just use this value. You could do that, but it's actually not required, and you could leave it empty because it is going to have the description start and description end appended to it, so you could still get your result without that. So for example, for my description start, I could say defeat. For my description end, I could say enemy. Like that. Now, the objective ID, this is the order of the objectives within the quest, so this will be the first objective of the quest. It could be the only objective of the quest, so I'm going to leave it at 0. And for the num required, I'll make it 1. So the description will be defeat 1 enemy. And it's not complete. Now, you can close this objective, and you can add another one if you want to. So for me, I may want to add a collection one, and I'll collect any item. So base collectible BP, doesn't matter what item it is. Again, I could leave description out if I want, and I could say collect item. This will be the second objective in the quest, so we'll put a 1 on there. And num required, we'll say 1. It's not complete. At this point, our quest is ready to go in this data table. It is completely set up. Now, getting started part 2, I haven't really filled out anything for. It was just an arbitrary one that I had here. But getting started has all the default data that we set up in our game mode BP. Just again, it's not hard-coded, it's now within this data table. So we can use this and make sure that everything is lining up with how it was in our game mode BP. So once you're done with your quest, go into your base game mode BP, and in the event begin play, we were just basically creating a quest, setting up the details, and then displaying it on the HUD. There's a lot of stuff going on here, but it was all explained in earlier quest episodes, so I'm not going to go over it today. The important part is actually just this section. I've added some other code up here, or other blueprint nodes up here, and we're going to use them in place of some of the logic we have here. So in begin play, we had a node where we were constructing a base quest. We basically need a quest object so that we can fill out the data on it, and that's what we were doing here. After this, we had a return value, and we were setting the current quest reference in the game mode. I think this is still valid because it's good to know which quest we have immediately focused for things like waypoints and dialogue that may be related to that quest. However, this is where things are going to start to change, because after this, we were setting the number of objectives to be 2, manually putting in the quest details, and manually setting up the objectives. This is good, this is fine, but this is one specific case. If the player is swapping back and forth, or if we load in and they've already completed other quests, we need to know all the information about the quest that they're on. So let's do exactly that. Now, it's a little bit ugly because I have it up here, and you know I like to keep logic that we're going to add up and out of the way so that I can show you us doing it live. Follow up above along with me here, and then we'll connect it at the end. We'll actually replace these nodes. But the reason I don't want to just get rid of these nodes now is I want to show you the comparisons. So once we construct the base quest, you can still set the current quest reference. Alternatively, you can check to see if the quest exists within the data table, and if it does, then we can set the current quest reference. And that's what I'm going to do. So I'm actually going to take my construct base quest and bring this into a new node, which is get data table row. Get data table row. Once you have this, you select the data table, and I'm going to choose my quest data table. For now, we don't have a certain way to determine what quest is selected or what is the latest quest that the user is on. So at this point, we are just going to use row 0. But you can make it an individual quest if you want to test that specific quest logic. Then you can drag off of the out row, which is basically the return value of all the data within that row, within that data table. And then just type break to get all the details about it. From here, we can go one step further and split the struct pin of the reward. So right click on your reward struct and split the struct pin. You'll get all your reward data. Then you'll have the nodes that I've got here. You can see that I am setting the current quest reference to the return value of the construct base quest. I'm just doing it after this row was found within this data table, because if for some reason we try and access a quest that doesn't exist, we could get some errors. So this is essentially like an is valid check for that quest data. And once it's found, then we set the reference. Now, I'm going to start cleaning this up while we go along so you can actually see what's going on, because I want to replace this logic down below with the logic we're adding up top. So we still have to do all the same stuff, such as setting the number of objectives, setting the details of the quest, and setting up the objectives. But we don't want to do it hard-coded where we're manually typing in this data. We want to use the elements from the data table. So it's pretty simple, actually. The current quest reference is a base quest object reference variable that we have within the base game mode BP. Now, what we want to do is drag off of our current quest reference and call all these functions, just like we did below. So I want to call setNumObjectives. However, it takes in a number of objectives. Before, in setNumObjectives, we were just saying 2, because we knew there were going to be 2 objectives. But instead, what we should do is actually make it so we base the number of objectives based on how many objectives are actually within the quest. So we can drag off the objectives array and type length to get this node here. And once you do, you then can pass the return value into the num objectives column. Now let's start cleaning this up a little bit so it's not so ugly. Now, after cleaning that up, we look a lot better than we did, and it didn't take me a lot of time at all. It only took me about a minute or two. So I basically just added reroute nodes to link everything properly. But instead of doing what we were doing before with the set quest details, how we were arbitrarily putting all the data in the name, description, rewards, we're just passing along from the data table. We take the quest structure that we broke and we pass the name into the set quest details function, name. Description, pass in the description. Now, remember we broke the reward structure, we split it? Well, the set quest details takes in an XP and an item obtained from the quest. So we can pass along our reward item and a reward XP as well. At this point, we're done with set num objectives and set quest details. So all of this will now work for every quest in the data table instead of just one where we've hard-coded it. That's already significantly better. The other thing we have to worry about are the individual objectives. Instead of setting up the objectives arbitrarily, we can also set them up based off the data in the data table. To do this, what we want to do is loop through all of our objectives. So I have a reroute node here going to a for each loop. Essentially, I'm dragging off the objectives array, typing for each loop, and selecting this one. Since we're looping through each objective, we don't need to manually put a bunch of setup objective nodes. We only need one. This is going to loop as many times that we have objectives. So if we have 5 objectives, it's going to loop 5 times, and we're going to call this node 5 times and add all those objectives. We drag off the array element, and I type break to break the objective, and I can press the down arrow to get all my variables within the objective. Simply enough, we now call our setup objective function, but instead of the arbitrary values, we use the values that we have from our broken objective here. So we have the target, which also comes from the current quest reference. We have the objective num, which is just the objective ID on the structure. The enemy type, which is the enemy to slay on the structure. The item, which is the item to collect. Description 1 and description 2 are now our description start and description end. Num required is num required. There's also is complete. This we actually could use in the future, but I'm not going to be using it now. You could hide it if you want by unchecking the pin, and it will go away. But like I said, we actually could use it in the future, so you may want to keep it for now. Then, once that for loop is completed, we're going to go to the node that was after the last setup objective in the previous logic, which is where we're choosing what character was assigned the quest. So we're just going to use this data to replace what was already here, and this will be a little bit more advanced. We don't have to do all this arbitrary stuff. We can actually use the data within the data tables. Now let's go and replace it. So if you feel confident, feel free to completely delete all this data. And then move over your logic so that your new logic will fit into that same gap. We'll make it look a little bit cleaner here in a second. Just move it over so that we can move this down. And then I would recommend making some space for yourself. I'm going to move it up like this. And now let's take a look at what we've got. So we have our construct base quest, which needs to be set to the current quest reference. But we use this get data table row quest data table to basically make sure that the row was valid. So pass it along here. Make sure everything looks nice. And we'll have to fix up this completed. But otherwise, it fits in. Make sure that the reroute nodes to your set character assigned to quest and anywhere else you need your quest reference here are still able to be grabbed. So the current quest reference, I have reroute nodes up here. I can reroute again. And I can manually connect this here some way. There we go. Now if I compile, it should compile. And last thing we need to do is just make sure it's nice and clean. But basically, just don't connect the loop body to this logic. Make sure that the last thing in the loop body is the setup objective, and then completed is what connects the next logic. So going through it one more time, this is what I'm going to show you. This is what it should look like. You can pause that at any point if you want to take a look at what we got. But now you'll be able to tell that we are using the data table, even though it looks exactly the same, right? Nothing changed. That's good that nothing changed, because that means we did it correctly. We were able to transfer it from an arbitrary value to the data table. Now, additionally to that, we can actually change our row names to access each quest. So if I change that, now I have Getting Started Part 2, which didn't have any data in it, so that is correct. If I go to row name 2, which corresponds to row name 2 on the data table, you'll see that we will now access the new quest we set up during this actual episode. So learning the basics, learn the initial controls of the game, we have to defeat one enemy, collect one coin. So I can punch this poor pumpkin golem, defeat my enemy, and I can collect one item. And there we go. We completed our quest. That's all that it takes to change the quest that is active now. This is only on begin play, so this will only work when we start up the game. But again, we haven't gone over changing quests or unlocking new ones yet, so this is where we have to work with it for now. But since it's that simple to change the quest that we're currently working on, you can probably guess that it won't be too hard to actually change quests when we get into that logic. We're just going to change the row of the data table so that we pull the appropriate data. Anyway, guys, that's all I got for you, so thank you so much for watching. I hope this video helped you make your quests within your data tables and transfer that information over. That way you can create quests pretty simply and also go and use them as opposed to hard coding the values into your game mode every time you want to switch quests. If it did, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do, and I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out again to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys for everything you've done. I really appreciate it. I'm really grateful. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. It is completely free, and I'd be happy to assist you with any trouble you ran into along the way. Like I said, guys, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.